Hello. On behalf of the Center for New Economic Diplomacy, may I welcome all our illustrious participants for this roundtable. Let me start with a few words about our center. We are a policy research institution committed to discovering solutions for some of our most pressing developmental challenges. We look at issues related to human capital and to climate change, and using some of the latest technological innovations to leapfrog development challenges that we face. And of course, we give an overriding importance to gender in all our conversations. We also look at the nuts and bolts of India's own development assistance program, and we advocate ways on how we can make this program more effective in meeting some of the mutual sustainable development goals that we all have. In our programs, we have a particular emphasis on Africa, on South and Southeast Asia, and on the Indo-Pacific. And through these programs, we aspire to build communities and to build platforms where we can share experiences and where we can learn from each other. The regions that we focus on are some of the hardest hit by the pandemic. We've seen that the disruptions have been most extreme in countries that have some of the lowest human capital development indices, which means that the gap between the rich countries and the poorer countries has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. And amongst those, the poorest, the worst hit are the women. In fact, there's a World Bank study that shows that women across almost 34 mostly low and medium income countries around the world that they surveyed showed that relative to men, women were 11 percentage points more likely to have lost their jobs during the pandemic. So we seek to find opportunities and learnings from this crisis to build better frameworks for women employees, to encourage and empower women entrepreneurs, and to ensure that best practices for industries that have a majority female workforce, such as the care economy, can be adopted. It is with this in mind that we have curated a series of roundtables, the first of those on the topic of gender and the importance of gender in economic agency. And without further ado, I'll hand over the platform to my colleague Mithali Mukherjee to take this conversation forward.
Hello and welcome to this very, very special conversation. Indeed, a big warm welcome from the CNET team. This is the Center for New Economic Diplomacy, and we're extremely enthused about this series that we're setting off. The first one, of course, is gender and economic agency within the context of COVID. I think if we were in a physical room, you would feel the energy of what we've got going, but even so, we make do with what we have, and I'm really excited to have such a thriving virtual room and so many cross sections of voices from across South Asia. Very, very happy to see representation from Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, and Nepal as well. My name is Mithali Mukherjee. Just to walk you through a little bit of what we're going to discuss over the next hour or so. We thought about the big imperatives post-COVID, and a few important pillars came to mind. Health, of course, what happens to education, what happens to technology transfer, but most importantly, what happens to gender. It has been seen in the past, and data drives that through, that any disaster or calamity always affects women disproportionately. That's exactly the case with COVID, and that is perhaps unfortunately the case across South Asia, whether it is in terms of access to economic empowerment, job losses, or a lot more burden in terms of familial duties. This is not to say that what we're trying to paint over here is an extremely bleak picture, but I think what we're trying to do is strike a balance between the reality of the situation and where the solutions might lie. Remember, it is only through engagement that we have found our best solutions, and what better way to do it than to tap on the shoulder of your neighbor and learn from them. So let me walk you through the course of the next hour before I get to my panelists. It's going to be a free-flowing conversation. We'll open with opening comments from all my panelists of about 2 minutes each, and then we'll really deep dive into this chat. Without further ado, may I introduce my very esteemed panel that I'm really, really excited to have on today. Radhika Kapoor, who's Senior Visiting Fellow at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, who will be bringing voice to what the situation in India is. Welcome, Radhika. Ramani Gunatilaka, who is an independent consultant and research fellow at the International Center for Ethnic Studies, and she brings all her perspective and insight from Sri Lanka. Ramani, great to have you over here. Also very excited to be crossing not just gender, but youth as well. Champel Peldon, who's youth leader and ambassador of Well-Read Bhutan and initiative of VCAP, joins in from Bhutan. Champel, welcome and thank you for cutting class in order to make it for this panel. We're really happy to have you here and to hear from you. And of course, we've got Sonia Bashir Kabir, who's founder SPK Tech Ventures and SPK Foundations. She's also, the vice chair of the UN Tech Bank for Bangladesh. Sonia, thank you for joining in. So much is riding on everything that we learn and see happening in Bangladesh, and I'm really, really keen on hearing from you as well. So, ladies, let's get straight into the conversation. Ramani, perhaps I could open with you to just lend a little bit of perspective in terms of what the post-COVID context looks like for Sri Lanka and what you see as the one or two key issues or key challenges that have presented themselves post this pandemic or in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you on this panel. I have to say that COVID has exposed some serious problems which we have begun grappling with. And I should say that in that sense, we are not very like the other South Asian countries. One is we have a rapidly aging population. The situation of women is a bit better in the sense that they are better educated and all that because of free education, but labor force participation is low. We are the third fastest aging population in Sri Lanka. So this whole care economy question is very relevant to us, and I would say that the pandemic has woken us up to the reality of it, because our vaccination drive didn't go very well. It was messed up. A lot of the elderly people are dying, and the next generation have other issues like diabetes, hypertension, and so on, which make them more vulnerable to COVID. But what the pandemic has shown is that here we have a population which is aging, where morbidity levels are high, and we don't have much time to get things in place. In a sense, once COVID is over, I see the crisis easing only a little bit, maybe enough to put in place some measures to cope with the big crisis of aging and morbidity that we are faced with.
Thank you for that and for setting that somber context. Of course, for Sri Lanka, I think MSMEs as well, are an important part of the conversation, which we'll get to later. Radhika, that brings me to India, where it's a little bit like I got 99 problems already. We were struggling even before COVID in terms of getting women into the workforce, in terms of poor labor participation rates. How bad has it been with COVID?
Thank you, Mitali. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this very important conversation. A year and a half into the COVID crisis, it's now abundantly clear globally that women have faced a disproportionate burden of this crisis, and this is true in India as well. We have a lot of data that corroborates that assertion. Just as an example, to give you the extent of gender disparity there is vis-a-vis job losses, there was a study which was done recently based on CMIE data, which essentially tracked, employment trajectories of people before the lockdown in December 2019 and after the first lockdown in December 2020. And what that data told us was that basically women were not only more likely to have lost employment compared to men, but they were also much less likely to have recovered employment compared to men. So this is telling us that both vis-a-vis job losses and getting their jobs back, women are at a seriously disadvantaged position in India. Now, in some sense, that's not quite surprising, because if you look at where women are employed in India, and I think that holds true for much of South Asia as well, they are basically working in sectors like hospitality, tourism, retail, a lot of contact-intensive services, which have not bounced back even now. Most of the women in South Asia and India in particular are also working in the informal sector, where they not only have low pay, but there's also no social security, there is no job security. So women have, of course, faced a disproportionate burden of the crisis, not just because of the sectors that they were employed in, but also because of the nature of employment that they were engaged in. And to top all of that, we know that women have had to bear the entire burden of unpaid household responsibilities, the unpaid care work at home, especially since schools have shut, childcare responsibilities have increased, and that has, pushed women also out of the labor force. So while the gendered implication of the crisis is actually very, very clear, with all the data that is already supporting this in India, it's quite surprising that our policy responses have not been very sensitive to this problem. Because if we want growth to be inclusive and we want it to be robust and resilient and sustained, we need to invest more in women. We need to create better employment opportunities for them. We need to create more employment opportunities for them. We need to bring them back into the labor market. And this, by the way, is not just a moral imperative, but is also an economic imperative, because we know that bringing these women back into the labor market will help to enhance growth. It will help to reduce gender inequality, which in turn will help to reduce income inequality and further drive growth. So I think investing in women is key for an inclusive post-pandemic recovery, and India has a lot to do on that front, because as you already stated, we've been grappling with this crisis of bringing women into the labor force for a long, long time, and that predates COVID-19.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think a big step would be an admission of how large and chaotic our informal sector is, perhaps one of the highest in terms of percentages worldwide. Sonia, that brings me to a very ambitious country, which is Bangladesh. You've set targets as a nation in terms of when you want to become an upper middle income, when you want to move to high income. And the perception generally has been that, unlike, what Radhika was pointing out, there has been some state level effort in terms of trying to bring, labor participation rates for women up. But walk us through, your own experience, especially as an entrepreneur, on how the last year and a half has been, and whether or not women have come out weaker, as has been the experience, it seems, across South Asia.
Thank you, Vitali. Thank you for inviting me. And the question is actually very interesting. And from my perspective, I'd like to have a little bit of a technology component, because that's what I work with. To set the backdrop with COVID, one of the things that COVID did was it accelerated the digital transformation that our country had planned, or even the world, as a matter of fact, because what happened with COVID in 3 months would probably not have happened in years, and in countries like ours it would not have happened in 5 years. It was suddenly payments went online, health was online, and education was online. So the three of the biggest verticals, health, education, and payments, forced people to embrace technology and start looking at the new normal from a tech perspective, which was actually a very welcoming experience for the women workforce. Yes, we've had lots of job losses, we've had lots of issues, but if I can focus more from the government's perspective and from the private sector perspective, the angle of taking women from isolation to inclusion, where technology has been a very has been an enabler to do that, because the rules of the game changed with technology, right? Everybody was at the same start line. No one had an advantage over another, because we were embracing technology from all levels for all efforts. Having said that, yes, there has been setbacks. I agree with what the previous speakers. The mental well-being, I think women were affected the most, because the amount of work that we had to do, working from home was no longer a fun thing to do, because you had more chores to do. You had household work, you had childcare work, elderly parents to take care of, and I think it's caused women a lot of burnout, which probably men didn't face as much as we did. And that's something in our part of the world, in our culture, we're not encouraged to come out and speak about depression. We're not encouraged to come out and say that, I'm not feeling well. You're supposed to be a superwoman. And I think that's going to take a toll on the well-being of women and the performance. No matter how much the state or the private sector open up avenues, I think it's going to be very challenging for us to deal with that aspect of how the mental well-being of a woman. So when later on we go into the conversation of the care economy, I would say the care economy first needs to focus on the women as opposed to the ones who need care, because this kind of what's happened with COVID is not visible, so it's very hard to trace, and then it will take a toll. Overall, I think that what's happened with the COVID, we've seen that from the perspective of women in business, the underbanked and the unbanked, there's been a lot of effort that has been brought forward to look at alternative alternative credit score, digital lending, so that you have more inclusion of the underbanked and unbanked, which includes women who are in business or women in SMEs. And the gig economy, which we'll also touch later, I'd like to highlight now, it has never been a better time than now for women to embrace opportunities sitting from home in the gig economy, because everything now has opened up with the new normal of world, allowing you to do anything, any place, anytime. And I'm very biased as a tech professional, but I would say that where technology has actually played a role to be an equalizer and also help scale. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think you've covered a lot of the important points, and we will delve into them. Jean-Pierre, I was looking at the data for Bhutan, and I think what struck me is the fact that unemployment levels are actually quite high, especially for the youth. If you go back to even 2019, they were in high double digits for the men, and they were as high as 13 to 14% for the young women. Walk us through your own experience of how and whether education has been impacted in the last year and a half, and whether that makes the youth more uncertain about employment opportunities, especially the young women.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mitali, for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. And as a young person, I think it is a very amazing opportunity for me to represent my country and to speak about on behalf of a lot of young people, especially the young women, and on behalf of my country. So thank you very much again. And like you've said, I agree on this. We have had we've had high unemployment rates as well. And in the past year, due to the pandemic, after the pandemic hit, all of us had to go under lockdowns and have online learnings. And Bhutan, I think, especially in the rural pockets of the country where a lot of young people are there, I think it has been a very big issue for not only us students, but for a lot of other people and for families as well, because not all the parents could afford, internet or could afford Wi-Fi or mobile phones or television. And even though we went under lockdown and we had to stay under lockdown for some time, we had online education. And I'm also the ambassador for VITO, which is an organization. And before VITO was an organization, we were formed as a lot of volunteer teachers coming together to work on online learning, and how they've actually telecasted a lot of online learning through the national channel. So I think with that, it was not enough to reach all the length and breadth of the country, to reach all the urban and rural pockets of the country. Of course, in the urban center, we have full access to television, to internet, social media, and a lot more. But what about the rural pockets? So yeah, that was definitely a big issue. And for the students who had to go through the online learning for so long, the results were not really good, and it has definitely impacted us a lot, because not all of these students and the young people were already used to using technology. Not all of us were used to using internet and Google Classrooms and a lot of the social media platforms, which actually helped us connect with the teachers. I think we were very privileged to have the opportunity, have our parents and family support us and have the access to it. But we did have a lot of situations in which a lot of rural kids, a lot of young people, a lot of new students were affected. So I think this is not only the case for Bhutan, but a lot of other countries in the world as well. So, yeah.
No, absolutely. Thank you for putting that out, and I agree with you completely. I think technology, just like many other privileges in the world, has been quite unequal, and it has impacted the way children have been able to access education. Ramani, I want to circle back to you on two important sectors, which is the care economy, and as I was mentioning earlier, the MSME space. I mean, that's huge for Sri Lanka. It has been a large contributor to economic, empowerment, but not so much for women. And I want to look at both these sectors through the money prism with you, because for a lot of women entrepreneurs, the experience seems to be that they struggle to scale up, they struggle to access finance, and again, for the key care economy, they struggle to get adequate compensation. Has that become worse post COVID, or do you think that people are now sitting up and talking about it, saying, "Hey, we need to correct this"?
I think right at the moment people are kind of firefighting. It's crisis management, and as some of the other speakers pointed out, the health of the economy and society before COVID has a lot to do with how you fare after COVID. And the health of the Sri Lankan economy wasn't very good before COVID. Growth was kind of petering off, and then we had the Easter bombs of 2019. So COVID has come at a very, very bad time. Having said that, we have issues in relation to women's employment. Women entrepreneurs, well, we have had all these microfinance programs and various interventions trying to promote women's entrepreneurship, but by and large, they have not been successful. There have been some good studies using longitudinal panel data and looking at the comparative profitability of male-owned and female-owned enterprises. And what seems to be the problem is that either social norms or the need to juggle the dual burden that women have to constrains the kind of enterprises they start. So they want something which will enable them to juggle both, or something which is socially acceptable. So those are not the most profitable of enterprises, and yes, they don't. I mean, it's true that they find it hard to scale up, but then we have to ask the question, do they want to scale up? Because many women choose these small enterprises because it allows them the flexibility and the time to manage the other things they've got to do. Now, if they try to scale up, then they are going to have to sacrifice something else they do. So I really don't know how effective this issue of helping people to find their own employment is going to be. And then given the needs of the care economy, what you find is that more and more women are going to be having to juggle more and more household tasks, particularly care-related tasks. And I have to say that the demands of care should not be underestimated, but they almost invariably are. And I have to tell you that I myself have been guilty of it, not so much in my work because I didn't look at that very much, but in the way I looked at the whole thing. Until, I became a primary caregiver myself to my 88-year-old mother. It's a different landscape. And a lot of the assumptions that people make about care really don't hold water. And I suspect that they are made by young people, relatively young people, who haven't had to do the caring themselves, particularly for old people. So I will stop there at that point, and we can come back to this a little later if you have the time.
No, absolutely. Either very young people, Ramani, or a group of men who decided what care should look like and what compensation should look like as well. Radhika, this one is intriguing in India again, right? Because that's the experience that's coming out over the last few months, that more and more women in B and C cities in India are turning towards entrepreneurship. But again, it's the same thing. It's not perhaps out of choice. It's out of the fact that there aren't any other jobs. And again, as Ramani was pointing out, I want to scale it because it's the only skill I have. But then, how much can I scale it?
Absolutely. Entrepreneurship is a very it's a great thing that we're having this conversation of entrepreneurship in the context of gender. But like Ramani said, I mean, we have to be very careful in understanding what that entrepreneurship means. Because in much of South Asia, and for India, of course, we know from the numbers that when we are talking about women being entrepreneurs, what they are really doing is running micro enterprises which would hire less than 5 workers, or many of them in fact operate without any hired workers, maybe just a few unpaid family helpers, or just the woman by herself. So these women are actually ending up in this kind of employment because of lack of other good jobs. So it is a lack of an alternative choice that is driving them into this work, as opposed to the fact that they want to do this because they're dynamic, they're risk-taking, they're entrepreneurial, and so on. So therefore, it's important that in the entrepreneurship landscape, we distinguish between those women who are turning to entrepreneurship as a survival strategy, as a sustenance strategy, as opposed to those who are actually doing this risk-taking work and are in non-traditional sectors. And unfortunately, most women in India are in the former category. And in the context of COVID especially, I mean, for them, for these women, it has been much harder because like we've already discussed, I mean, the entire burden of the unpaid household responsibilities has fallen on these women. They've had to deprioritize their business. Many of these women have not been aware of the various support schemes that were available from the government. A lot of the support that has come for entrepreneurs has been online in nature. Sometimes these women are not digitally literate, they're not financially literate, so they've not even been able to avail of these schemes. Marketing for their product has moved online, so they might not have had the digital skills to do that. So definitely, we need to create an environment where these women can thrive. And we also have to recognize that a lot of these women are doing this work because it gives them the flexibility that they require to do all their other care responsibilities at home. So therefore, in that sense, we do need to rethink what can be done to support these kind of survivalist enterprises who are entrepreneurs or micro-entrepreneurs. But at the same time, I think one thing we should focus on in this conversation of entrepreneurship with respect to gender is that what can we do to actually have a lot of these dynamic women entrepreneurs? I mean, what kind of environment can we create to enable this? Now, in India, there's so much talk about these unicorns and startups. But if you look at the numbers, I mean, basically, amongst all the unicorns that are there, there's just one that is actually run by a woman CEO, and that's Lanka. And, these kind of role models are very important for society. Because, of course, like we all know that if women are entrepreneurs, it gives them income, it gives them economic agency. They're a part of decisions that are taken at the household level, especially vis-a-vis investments in education and health of their children. But also, having these kind of successful women entrepreneurs in a country has a spillover effect vis-a-vis, the role modeling effect that they create for other women. The fact that these women have been able to break patriarchy norms and establish themselves is something which is really so significant, and we underestimate. Because when we're talking about how do we create this environment for entrepreneurship, we talk about things like access to credit, technology, marketing, and so on. But to be that kind of entrepreneur, you also need to develop soft skills for women. You need to help them, take on risks, be more confident. The whole environment, there is unequal bargaining power between men and women. So if it's a woman who's operating a big business, not only does she have to deal with the fact that, when she might be dealing with her vendors, her customers, but her own employees, she might be in a weak bargaining position because she's a woman. So I think we need to also focus more on how do we create these few even if it's very few, but we must have these risk-taking women in non-traditional sectors who step out of their comfort zone, not just because of the role model effect, but also because these women then create more employment opportunities for other women, because such enterprises typically hire women. So I think women entrepreneurship is something that we definitely need to turn to post-COVID and apply our mind to what kind of entrepreneurship, make the distinction between the micro entrepreneurs and the dynamic entrepreneurs, and what policy can do for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, that one unicorn head is also someone who spent many decades, Radhika, in the world of capital markets. So she's actually circled back to something that she, first got the hang of. I'm not sure how many other women entrepreneurs have been able to do it. But you raised 2 or 3 important issues, and I want to delve into them. One is economic packages, the other is skilling. So I'm curious to hear your experience, especially as an entrepreneur, but specifically from the lens of microfinance. Because, on this access to credit issue, I think Bangladesh has generally stood out as an example where microfinance has worked quite successfully. Is that a model you think that should be delved into deeper when you're looking at helping women entrepreneurs instead of, broadly talking about access to credit? Is this the way to go?
Yeah, thank you, Mithali. I think you bring up a very good point that yes, this microfinance has been successful, but it does have, we have 30 million borrowers today on the microfinance model. But what microfinance is still untouched by technology. And what I was trying to tell you earlier, that everything is moving into the tech space. And I'd like to highlight more on Radhika's point that she made, that yes, there is a lot of technology coming, but the digital literacy is not there. And even when you have the digital literacy, the digital readiness has to be there. Excuse me. You can take a few classes, but you are not ready to immerse yourself in that. So, and microcredit and microfinance is going into the tech space. So it will solve a lot of problems, but the infrastructure is what we need. And that's what the governments from our part of the world need to be focusing on. There's the device and there's the connectivity. You can offer everything, but if a woman does not have a smartphone, or if she cannot afford a smartphone and she cannot afford connectivity, you've lost everything, right? Because you're sitting there with lots of citizen services, which are e-services, but the user does not even have access to that. And let's say the user has access, but then she does not know how to use that. So there's a lot of training that needs to be happening, and there's a lot of encouragement, as Radhika said, then how do we bring these women from where they are to where the future is? What we've seen is that they're very resilient, right? They may not be educated. The microfinance women that we're talking about, they may not be educated. They may not have any idea, but they're very eager to learn, and that's where we need to step in and show. And I'll just like to highlight one example for a project that we did. It was in a very, it wasn't a very big scale. It was about 500 women, and we focused mostly on the sex workers because they lost their jobs with COVID, right? And they had to support their families. They're like any other woman. And what we did was we actually trained them on how to make videos on smartphones. So we arranged 500 smartphones, and then we gave them training on how to make videos, and we connected them with the weavers and the fashion designers, and saying how we can display your product because travel was restricted. And you'll be surprised, most of them are earning about $100 a month, and it was a small pilot project, but it showed that they were not scared, they were not afraid. They were afraid of their children dying of hunger. So they were not afraid to learn something new, and that's what we really need to do, is boldly go and not just assume that they will not. Some will not, but even for the microfinance, right? You take a credit, but what do you do with it? So boldly get more women into this space and give them opportunities from financing to getting business. Just giving them money is not going to be enough. It's also about making sure that they can do something with that money. That is something that is now relevant. What they did in the past may not be relevant anymore.
Yeah. Champal, as someone who is a youth ambassador, I'm keen on hearing your thoughts on the importance of skilling with specific reference to what was just being discussed, not just digital literacy, but digital access as well. Do you think something needs to be done in that regard? Or conversely, do you think there's been an example that has really worked well in terms of encouraging digital literacy and access?
Thank you very much. I think, as you've highlighted, the importance of digital literacy is as important as having access to digital phones or, computers and many more. And as a young person, I feel that digital literacy in today's world, in the 21st century world, is very, very important, not just to the young people, but in specific to young women. Because as the previous speakers have highlighted on a lot of issues, I totally agree on all of them. On when agreeing to the point where, in no matter which case or no matter what happens, somehow it is women and the young women who falls victim to it or who suffers more than the men. So I personally feel that digital literacy and having access to digital literacy, training the young women and women on the importance of digital literacy can actually have a lot of impact on them. Like, it can actually save their lives, because there are a lot of issues these days on cyber bullies and cyber attacks, and we've not only seen it in and around our society, but even globally. It has been a very important, it's been a major issue. And I think that as a young woman and as someone who has facilitated digital literacy and media literacy in particular, I feel that it has not only helped the young people who are being trained, but also for me, speaking from my personal experience, being trained in media literacy actually made me more aware of the power of social media and how we can actually use them in a very proper way. But the effect of not being able to use social media in a proper way can actually have a bigger impact and effect on the young women, because at the end, it's them who falls prey to it. And then at the end, when everything happens, there's nothing we can do. But before things happen, I think there are a lot of precautions and a lot of things we can do to prevent these issues from happening. So if we start from our community, let's just say from a small society, if we are able to make the change in the perspectives and in the minds of the young women about the importance of being aware of what they post on social media or what they post on internet, and the effects that can follow it after that, it must just seem very easy for us to post something online and think that it's gone and it's no more, but the effect that it follows up after, the consequences after that, is a lot more dangerous than we actually think. And the importance to let all the young people know about it is very urgent. And I think it's not only to people with no access to phones or internet, but especially to those who already have access. So these days, everybody of us have access to internet. So among that population, again, it's more of young people who are involved. So digital literacy can actually not only make them safe and be able to live in a safer society, but also give them the opportunity to use it in a proper way. And even entrepreneurship and even the gig economy, for example. So young women and a lot of people through gig economy have actually, with the access to technology and internet, have made more profits than most of the working people these days. I think with right guidance and with the literacy, making them aware and alert on the power of being able to use media and digital technologies, digital platforms in a better way, can actually open more opportunities than they can imagine right now. And like what the previous speakers have said, creating opportunities for women is actually giving them the opportunity to become an entrepreneur, for example, can open more opportunities for for employment of other women and young people. So in Bhutan as well, I think the unemployment rate can be actually brought down drastically if that is being provided.
No, I hear you. And I think you raised some cogent points, although I personally am quite intrigued about the pros and cons of the gig economy, and I think we'll debate that in a bit. Ramani, I want to come to you about some of the streams that are coming through on a slightly different topic though. I mean, it's clear that skilling, i.e. digital literacy and access, is important. It's clear that economic support is important. But when you talk about mental health pressures, or you talk about online abuse, or what has now been rampant across most nations, the rise in domestic violence, do you think there is a much stronger case to be made for social protection? Because again, unpaid care, unpaid domestic work, heaped on top of which is other forms of abuse. Is this the time to really push hard to put a stronger social protection norm in place, especially in South Asia?
I think, Mitali, it's both these issues, social protection and the issue of abuse uh, through cyberspace and all. What it shows is the institutional weakness in most of our societies. I mean, this issue of cyberbullying, the all that which goes on takes place because there are no institutions. The laws are either not there or they are there and are not being monitored. The whole system of justice and holding people accountable isn't working very well. So that is going on at that end. So if you have governance structures which can't cope with that, how capable do you think they will be in putting in place an effective social protection system? Quite apart from the revenue needs of a social protection system, which are hard to come by in our societies, there is also the issue of the role played by influence networks. So your social protection scheme, for instance, may not be really targeted well so that those who really need it get it. And that has been the experience of Sri Lanka. We have social protection schemes, but they are not targeted well. There are political imperatives to give access to people who don't really need it. As a result, people who need it don't get it. So I think at the end of the day, we have this malaise in governance, which we have to recognize, and we need to figure out to what extent we can expect the governance structures in our societies to recognize the problem, to figure out what can be done about it, and to actually do it. So I would like to leave that thought with you, really.
Yeah. Radhika, you want to jump in on that social protection? And I think the one other vertical of problem I didn't mention is how early data is also suggesting that sexual health and reproductivity, all of that has also turned turtle in COVID. Women have lost access to any form of contraception, etc., that they could have otherwise had access.
Absolutely. Social protection is just so critical to this entire conversation. And in some sense, it applies as much to men as it does to women. Because, we went into this crisis, and this is true for all of South Asia, with much of our labor force in the informal sector, which is outside the ambit of standard employer-employee relationships. So people don't have access to any form of social security. Safety nets are pretty poor. We've seen that in the case of India over the course of the last year, where we saw the migrant crisis unfold in front of our eyes, where people had to walk hundreds of kilometers back home with their children on their back. Women with children on their back as well, because there were no social safety nets, and the only alternative they had was to get back home so that they could get food from the farms. And there was one safety net, which was Narega, that was available to them. So I think the need for social protection is, of course, absolutely critical. There need to be stronger safety nets. These safety nets have to be there regardless of what is your employer-employee relationship. So I'm actually going to link this to the point that you made about the gig economy before this.
Yeah.
Because we are talking so much about the gig economy, and most certainly the gig economy and these digital platforms will be a very important tool for enhancing women's participation in the labor market. But there's a downside to this as well, because remember that the gig economy is nothing but a new type of informal work arrangement which is there. And so people, especially women who are going to be in the gig economy, are again going to be outside the ambit of any social security cover, including maternity health. So therefore, how do we bring decent work? How do we bring social security into the gig economy is a question we need to think of more seriously. Now in India, we have actually started thinking of this question. We have this new social security code, which actually for the first time used the word gig economy. and it said that there would be social security cover provided to gig economy workers. I mean, this was a good start in the sense that for once we are at least acknowledging the existence of this gig economy. Of course, how it will pan out is a different matter, because then later they said that the platforms would have to basically allocate 1 to 2% of their turnover to make social security, to make contributions into the social security fund for their gig workers. And I'm not quite sure if that's an adequate sum to actually provide any meaningful social protection, especially for women who would want to be covered for maternity provisions. But having said that, I think there's one more thing I want to highlight about the gig economy is that we must be very careful about what we are in fact classifying as gig workers. Because very often what the platforms are doing is that these workers, these gig workers as we are calling them, are working as employees of the platform, but for basically averting contributions to social security and so on and giving the platform more flexibility, they are being labeled as independent contractors or self-employed. And that distinction needs to be made, whether a person who is working via a platform, is he in fact an employee of the platform, or is he in fact an independent contractor? Now, we've seen this in the US, where California passed this AB5 law, where they said that the Uber drivers were in fact employees and they would be covered by minimum wages. And there they laid out a very clear distinction between, whether you were an employee or you were an independent contractor, depending on the nature of the relationship with Uber and how dependent or independent you were of the employer. And there was something similar that happened in the UK. So I think for women, this is going to become even more important, because many women are moving to the gig economies because of the kind of flexibility that is being provided to them there. So definitely, regardless of the nature of what is your contract, your employer-employee relationship, there has to be social security cover, both for men and women. And this is really what even the ILO has talked about in its centenary declaration about a universal labor guarantee for all workers.
Sonia, I'd love to hear, what you think about this. I echo a lot of what Radhika says, because it's a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde. The gig economy, on the face of it, looks like a great solution for a woman working from home, but it comes with no benefits. It comes with no childcare support. It comes with very little in terms of, leave if you may need it. It's almost like, here's 3 treadmills and I'd like you to run on all 3 at the same speed, and I don't really care, if you're struggling with that. What's a better way to go about this whole big gig economy conversation, you think, given what we lived through in COVID?
Yeah, thank you, Mithali. So firstly, the gig economy opens up a source of income, right? And the offset, it's just saying that if you have zero income, and you have no benefits, at least you have access to income or making some money, and that's the first. But that's not, I agree with all of you, that's not how we would like it to end, right? It's only the beginning of getting women access to work, which they otherwise would not have. I think what would happen is as the economy becomes more mature, then we would have these policies in place where the women would get protected. But I don't see that, to be very honest, I don't see that happening in the near future because of the way the world is right now. What we just have to accept it, that women are just going to be able to go from earning income versus no income. And the benefits are going to be addressed later. We have an uphill task because we have to fight, and we have to have policies protecting women for their security, for their childcare, for insurance, or whatever you may have. But unfortunately, I don't see a quick solution to this, and this is a problem that the gig economy we will have to deal with it as we move forward.
Dominic, there's a larger point from what you raised earlier about the fact that there is perhaps not even the confirmation or affirmation that these problems exist to start working on them. I know this is going 2 steps away from our core conversation, but I was struck by some other data that I was reading about Sri Lanka, where only 12 out of 225 legislators are women, and at no point since 1931 has there been more than 7% female representation in the highest political chambers of Sri Lanka. Does it boil down to that? There's just not enough of our voices in the rooms that count.
Absolutely. I think if there were more women representing the rest of us in parliament, we would be able to get a lot more stuff done, which would be beneficial for women. But here again, it's ironic, as you say, in 1931, Sri Lankan men and women were given the vote at the same time. Even in the UK, I think men got it before us, or something like that, but not here. And of course, we produced the first prime minister in the world, and so on. But of course, that is due in part to the nature of politics, the family, community, kin based structure of politics, and also the culture of politics. Most women don't like to get into politics and represent other women in even the local government councils because of the violence, the kind of abuse and character assassination that they have to undergo. And you cannot really become a politician without the support and blessing of your family. No family is going, I mean, very few families, unless they are political families themselves, and see a woman candidate as having a better chance at coming to power than a male in their family, would back a woman, would back a daughter to enter politics. So I think the culture of politics is such that males have a competitive advantage. I mean, you have to be able to character assassinate. You have to be able to yell at people. I mean, all these things. You have to threaten people and intimidate them. You have to grab funds in order to finance your campaign. I mean, most women aren't even working. Where are they going to get the funds? So in this sort of political culture, which does not give women an equal opportunity in the political sphere, then I think you really need to have quotas. And it's working to some extent in local government, because they brought in a quota saying that 25% of local councillors need to be women. And of course, that encouraged some women in, but then they found that when they got into the councils, they couldn't get themselves heard. They couldn't speak. So now what you find is that the women councillors are kind of ganging up together, regardless of party. So that, I think, is a very good sign. But just like in the local government elections, you need quotas for women representatives in other levels of government. And we really need to work towards that. I think if we are able to do that, then a lot of the issues will be addressed. The problem we have is that men have been running things their way for far too long.
More reason to want to see young women like Jampel in politics and STEM and finance and, really up the game. Jampel, we're all looking at you. So I think we're winding down to conclusions. Maybe what I'll do is again go around the table. What I want to hear from you is, over the next year or so, Jampel, what is it that you would like to see in terms of 2 or 3 tangible policy moves that you think will help the youth, that you think will help young women, and you think will really alleviate some of the damage done by COVID?
Thank you. So, as a young person and interacting with a lot of young people over the past few years, and being a part of a lot of organizations and groups, I think it has given me an eye-opening experience, and always made me more aware and gave me more insights and more knowledge. So over the past next few years, I think what can really help in broadening the perspectives and broadening the minds of the young people and the young women would actually be creating more opportunities for them to take part in, where they can actually put up their voices on the pertinent issues that are related to young people and young women and women in general. And Bhutan has already been doing a lot and the relevant CSOs or NGOs or organizations have been doing so much for the young people in Bhutan and for the youths and for young women. We have so many organizations that works towards the safety and protection of women and their rights. And even during the lockdowns, during the last lockdown that we had Her Majesty the Queen really concerned about women. So how she, had shelter homes for them, for women who are having domestic violence at home, and free hotline numbers on all the relevant media pages and media networks where women can actually call out for help and put their voice out. So in the next past years, I think opening more opportunities for young people and women to voice out about their issues, about the pertinent issues going around them that they are experiencing and that they see around, I think it will give them more opportunities to voice out their opinion, to bring changes in the society. So I think it's high time for the young people to voice out about the issues that they're facing and their opinions, and for the adults to actually start believing in us today and not only say the youths or the young leaders or the young people are the future. The future, I think it's here right now today. We are the future and we're here. So I think we need more opportunities to voice out our opinions and, give us platforms where we can actually experience things, hands-on learning, not just from the textbooks, not just in school, but beyond the four classroom walls and beyond just textbook knowledge, but about the rights, about the safety, about media literacy and digital literacy, about entrepreneurship, and a lot more important things. So I think that will really help us. And we're very fortunate. I'm very fortunate, and I think all the Bhutanese feel very fortunate to be born in Bhutan because we have our government and a lot of organizations working to do that. But I think we can still do a lot more in the future. So I think young people and women have to come together to make changes and to bring changes if we want them in our society.
No, absolutely. And I think the youth has been one of the most vocal and passionate voices about climate change. So there is all the more reason to be listening to these voices. Sonia, let me turn to you, in terms of your wish list. I know you've talked quite in detail about skill identification and skill enhancement. What would you put that down into, 2 or 3 concrete things you want to see over the next year?
So one of the things is we have laws against violence against women, which is non-available jail, but there's nothing against cyberbullying. As more and more women are going to go into the tech world, we see that this is an issue and we need some very serious laws protecting women against that. And on the other hand, is like we need more role models and mentors. So there we need some help on policy that, promoting women, getting away from the men's club and actively promoting women. Our government is doing a very good job in getting representation in government, but it's nearly not enough as we would like to see. These are 2 that I would focus on. And the last one is, encouraging, again, I'm very myopic with my tech view, but STEM education is important, but we realize that going through a formal academia is not affordable for many. So vocational skills training targeted for women with employability. So, we shouldn't just stop at giving them a certificate and getting kudos for doing that. We should say from educational or from skills training to employability, that should be a policy around that. So these are the 3 that I would briefly mention.
Radhika, your turn. You've talked about so many of these issues, but if you had to pinpoint 2 or 3 that you really want to see people getting serious about.
Well, it would be more than 2 or 3, but I would not take too long. I think the first is to basically just recognize the burden of unpaid care work that women face, because over the last 1 year, there have been many women who just had to drop out of the labor force because they can't deal with doing a job, be it full-time or part-time, and concomitantly handle household responsibilities. So we need to recognize that burden of unpaid care work. We need to think about how it is to be redistributed, not just between men and women, but also between households and governments. The second also is that, while the first point is about unpaid care work, there is also the issue of paid care work. While we have spoken about how women have borne a disproportionate burden of the COVID crisis, it is also true that women in certain positions have performed exceptionally well during the crisis, and they have been frontline workers. I think we need to reward the paid care work more adequately. Just to give you an example, in India, we know that there are ASHA workers who are the frontline care workers. They have risked their lives through this pandemic, and yet they don't even get a minimum wage. What they get is basically referred to as an honorarium, and that is just about 2,000-3,000 rupees a month, if I'm correct. So we need to reward these paid care workers more adequately. The third thing I would say is that, going back to the issue of social protection, what the crisis has taught us is that we need to have adequate safety nets in place, and these need to definitely prioritize women. For example, in the case of NREGA, which is the employment guarantee program that you have in rural India, we saw that many women were actually pushed out and were not able to get work because men had moved back to the villages and they were seeking work under the program. So we need to make sure that there is adequate opportunity for women even to access these social safety nets. And here, your address has proposed a very nice equivalent of NREGA in urban areas, where he talks about an urban workfare program which will be focused entirely on women. So I think that's something we need to think about more seriously as a safety net. The fourth I would say is that, vis-a-vis the government also needs to think about what are the sectors which create good jobs for women. I think we know, like textiles, apparel, these typically employ more women. What can we do to boost these kind of sectors, which will generate more employment opportunities for women? And some of these are already covered in things like the production-linked incentive scheme that the government is doing. Perhaps there could be some incentive linked there to employment for women as well. And finally, let me conclude by saying that I think addressing the digital divide is absolutely crucial in a post-pandemic world, because women will most certainly be left behind, even more than they already have, if that digital divide is not addressed.
Ramani, final word with you. What's your imperatives list for the year ahead or longer?
Thank you, Mitali. My first item would be the whole political representation thing, which we talked about, so I won't go into that again. The second thing is listening to Jampal from Bhutan. I was struck by certain issues we are facing, being an aging population. Now Jampal asked that youth be given a voice. Now in our society, because it's aging, the older people are sitting in positions of decision making. And the young people, it's okay, they are not being given a voice, but in any case, because of all this digital technology, the young people live in a world of their own in cyberspace. So there are two things going on here. How do we enable young people to become engaged and also give them a voice, and also kind of shut the old people up a little and make them give space? I think that is an issue which we need to address. The second issue is in relation to the care economy. I think in a way, you see, the way we approach problems, we tend to think in boxes. When you look at, say the paid care economy, yes, with aging, there are going to be more opportunities for them. But don't forget that across the world, the rich will be able to pay for care. The rich in the rich countries will be able to pay more for care than the rich in poorer countries. So basically what we will find is that women who can escape the care burdens in their own homes, which will be the vast minority, will be able to earn more. And because there will be a scarcity of such labor compared to demand, I think wages will be high and people will work on improving working conditions. The bigger problem I see here is the unpaid care worker at home. Life is going to be hell for her. It's not like, those days people had 6-7 children and looking after 2 old people is divided amongst at least half the children, so that the marginal costs per person weren't so high. Now it's different. Families are smaller. One person has to do everything. And remember that this one person is also aging. Most likely she's post-menopause, hypertension, diabetes, and she's going to be needing care sooner than her parents did. So this is a kind of demographic time bomb, which is there. We are closer to it in Sri Lanka than perhaps India and Bangladesh with a much younger population is. But these are things we need to think about, and also think of technologies like this issue of Pampers, right? Make them cheaper, make them more eco-friendly. These are things we need to work on right now.
Absolutely. I wish we were in a room so I could reach out and give you a hug, Ramani. I feel all your pain and more. Different from yours as a young mother, but I hear you. It's been a difficult year for women in so many ways. Thank you, all of you, for your time, for your patience, and most of all, I think, for your honesty that you brought to this conversation, because I don't think there's any way you can talk about solutions if you aren't brutally honest about where the problems lie. Thank you very much for joining in today. I really, really appreciate it.